Okay, so I'm waving to everyone on Twitch, people that are watching this on YouTube, I'm waving. If you're watching this not live, that wave was to tell people we just had several minutes of setup. So I'm CO Ebert, and today we're going to be talking about the hero's journey motif. The original title of this lecture was as a tool of oppression, and it still is, but maybe oppression is a strong word. Um, Sometimes it's not too strong a word. And but also sometimes just normativity and bias. But also another aspect is we're going to talk about even when those are addressed with the hero's journey, with things like the heroine's journey, the issues of creative stifling still exist, even if the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues have been addressed. So first of all, who am I? I am known online by the gaming tag Wayne Drag. Um, I am also CO Ebert, Dr. C.O. Ebert in real life. Somehow I convinced the University of Portsmouth to give me a PhD. Um, and somehow I'm giving you a lecture. By the way, if you want to get into giving lectures, make a lot of notes about what I do and do the opposite. But before we do that, for probably about half of you watching, you know what the hero's journey is. You know it from university. You know it from just being a fan. You know from chatting with other fans about stuff. But I actually think there may be a fair number of people who don't know what the hero's journey is, even if you don't know it by name, but you certainly know its effects. So we are gonna do a hero's journey 101, but it's gonna be pretty brief. So first of all, what is the hero's journey? So the hero's journey was largely introduced by Joseph Campbell. No academic movement is singular, but he's definitely the name associated with it, the one that gave it its name. It comes together mostly in his book, Hero of a Thousand Faces. Joseph Campbell is a mythologist who had a very popular PBS series, I think in the late 70s, early 1980s, called The Power of Myth. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, PBS reran it during their pledge drives. So a lot of people in America know who Joseph Campbell is. And in The Hero of a Thousand Faces, it describes a pattern of storytelling, which this is how it's usually purported and not entirely inaccurate, but it's described often as if this is fact rather than a lens to look at stuff. So it's described as this motif of the journey of a hero that essentially is the spine of all great world stories, especially going backward in time to the classic myths. And it's often described as an archetypical journey, an archetype being like the images you see on the tarot card, the archetypes of Jung, these primordial images of, say, the wise old teacher or the wise grandmother, the young virginal princess that we see over and over again in cultures again. But the idea of archetypes doesn't exist until the 19th, 20th century. Not that there wasn't anything like them, but the first problem with archetypes is that we presume our archetypes are one, universal, and two, that they go back in time usually further than they did. Most of the archetypes that we have now in our collective unconscious and in our literature and our popular culture. But anyway, it's archetypical, and it's this spine of stages of a story, um, specifically focused usually on a singular hero, main hero. And it's mostly about a change that goes on inside the hero internally in relation to the external world. And we'll get to the stages in a minute. And it's never about just the hero doing something in the external world only. And usually the world is portrayed as flawless with some kind of villain that has corrupted the world. And the villain is usually, even if it's represented by a figurehead, like in Star Wars, there's Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, but the empire, but the universe itself and the Force is not wrong. You know, the Force has the light and dark side. It's just how people will tap into it. And the overarching theme through all Star Wars stuff is the Empire. So which is a little different than, say, a Holmes and Moriarty kind of thing. Characters in the hero's journey are often very one-dimensional. So how did Campbell arrive at this? He arrived at what he called his monomyth, because he started looking. I think we can go to the next slide, actually. Well, this is how he did it. he looked at what he thought were commonalities of all great world myths, Western, Eastern, and indigenous, and looked for the commonalities and therefore presumed there was a root myth behind them. But one of the first things that he did was he already basically had the framework for what he wanted the hero's journey to look like when he started out on this. And when he used European or Western myths, he used often their most modern and appropriately deemed telling. When he used indigenous and Eastern myths, he used Western interpretations of those narratives. And often myths have various versions. And so he would cherry pick the ones that he liked because he already had the framework for the monomyth of how he wanted it to be. So by his own admission, he was not led by the evidence. He fit the evidence together like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's, before we criticize him, we'll see that's kind of a natural thing to do and why he did that. But it's definitely Eurocentric. Although he was an atheist, he openly admits the influence of Christianity on his view. Not only a white background, but particularly an American Anglo-Saxon background. Not that a Eurocentric upbringing. And he was pretty privileged. I don't know if he was wealthy in youth, but certainly he was making good bank as a professor pretty early on. So class came into it too. And you can say that there's nothing wrong with being wealthy or white, being male, and putting a thing together. But when you're doing it only through that lens and all those normatives, there's going to be some bias. And also, he did a lot of selective interpretation, and he really didn't engage much directly with indigenous people, marginalized groups, or people from the East on their myths. He mostly took interpretations from other Westerners, but he's hardly alone in doing that in his time. We'll get back to this in a minute. Did we skip a slide? No, we didn't. I guess my slides are a little bit out of order. All right. So this actually, my slides are out of order. This is the next one. So the context for this, why were people looking for universals and root truths? Well, this is the start, in the Victorian era and the early modern era before that is the start of empiricism. And empiricism, of course, is part of the scientific method. It's part of objective thinking. But the Victorians overused this. So they had great success with the Linnaean classification system, which is that whole genus, species, phylum, kingdom thing. Dogs are Canis familiaris. Humans are Homo sapiens. And they started applying this very boxy categorical scheme thing to almost everything. And one of the things that came out of it that actually is surprisingly useful is the Arne Thompson Uther Index of folk tales, which there are precursors to that index, but essentially they would identify features of a myth, say all stories, whether they came from China or the Middle East or Europe, because they could travel through the Silk Road, or India, that featured a scheming stepmother or a absent father, grieving father who wasn't there for his daughter because the mom died or something. And they would label each feature of a myth as a C1. So all C1s had a wicked stepmother. And all things that ended with N2 had an antagonistic, aggressive wolf character. And they use this to categorize a lot of folk tales and fairy tales. And it's not completely useless. It's actually very useful. And they were able to tell sometimes that that's how they, for instance, determined, and it was later proven by more modern methods, that Cinderella started in China. But it was very boxy, almost genetic. And it's a little too boxy for the way humans work. And there were also search for these universals. There was this idea that if you could find the common features of things, whether it be language, religion, creation myth, or the root of all stories, and roll them back in time, you could find like the original root human religion, root human language. And it's not necessarily completely untrue, but the problem is the way they were using it was, first of all, what are called foregrounded features, which means foregrounded features means what we consider important in language, in our time, in our language, in our stories, in our myths. And therefore, those were the things they were looking at in all myths, languages, things like that. Crowley's religion of Thelema is an attempt to roll back the clock by finding all commonalities, to find the original human mystical and religious system. And the other thing is presuming that the way things are now must, in certain ways, be universal in how they always were, and it inevitably leads to constructing your, fitting your. It leads to inevitably fitting your conclusion into your end. And no matter what culture you are or what your identity is, if you do not engage with other cultures and specific historians who have understandings of that culture in a time period, you won't overcome. It doesn't matter your gender, your race, your background. No one is capable without engaging with people who have an innate understanding of other times and other cultures, or in the case of other times, the best innate understanding we can have, and rolling back this clock. So a lot of people were looking at this. So Campbell was inspired by this to look for this monomyth, this hero's journey, which is the root of all stories. And it also causes you to essentially ignore cultural specificity. And in the case of that, so for nearly all Western language based, a little less for Italian and German, but especially in English, we tend to focus on specific objects in a story, the characters, the environment, an event. It's also, by the way, how we approach solving math. As you get into the Romance languages and then further into the purely Eastern languages like Japanese and Chinese, everything is context oriented. You can see this in games like Elden Ring that started out in Japan, where a lot of the story of what happened in the world requires you to look around in the environment, versus something like Skyrim, where the background of that world is told to you literally by finding books that tell you what it is. That is just the natural object or context or object oriented storytelling or critical thinking. So that's one thing they can use, and it often oversimplifies myths outside of what is the mainstream. The biggest sin of that is when a monotheist is looking at a polytheistic religion and just saying, well, the only god that matters is the king or queen of the gods, who's a cognate with my one god. So that was what he was looking for. But now, just for worth mentioning, there is kind of possibly a creation monomyth, and it's called the Earth Driver myth. And it was done by a collaborative team over 50 years. John White has an amazing lecture on it that takes you through the evidence stage by stage. And this is a case where this is before Out of Africa. This is when we were all on the African savannah, pre-literate. It may be 140,000 years old. It's not a complete story, but it's just features. And it's called the Earth Driver myth. This is kind of, so there kind of is possibly a monomyth, just not the way Campbell approached it. And it was the earliest story people had for how the world came about. The reason it's called the Earth Driver myth is that this is literally all cultures, all peoples, all times, going back to when we were one people, only halfway past the point of becoming fully modern humans. We've been modern humans for 300,000 years-ish. This is 140,000 years ago. It's the halfway point in our journey. So there could have been an older one. But it's called the Earth Driver because in the oldest myths, nothingness is not a black void with nothing in it. It is a sea of endless possibility, which is not entirely unlike quantum vacuum theory, which says nothingness isn't really nothing. That's just a coincidence, though. And it's only in more modern times they sort of get to Sumer, Babylon, and even Roman Greece, and even early Jewish and Christian thought, Chinese thought, that this idea of a void of black nothing, there's no time, that was the void, that was nothingness. So nothingness was like the potentiality for all things, the endless sea. And a bird, sometimes a creature, maybe an otter, but the earliest one seems to be a bird, goes down and gets a pebble or some kind of earth and starts constructing a mound. And then from that, the earliest people emerge, and then later on, God of the gods. And one of the reasons that it took so long to get to the Earth Driver myth is and this is probably flood myths are probably a remainder of this. The flood myths are a remainder of the nothingness being water and the water needing to recede. But later, when stories changed that things arose from literal nothingness, that meant that there had to be an earth that got flooded. So that's one of the theories John White puts forward, that the flood myth was originally to account for somebody going, wait, what are the waters receding from? And originally that was unnecessary because everyone accepted that the mound just got big enough and then the waters went away because of the necessity for things to be on sort of what we call magical realism. John explains it much better, and he's much more interesting than me. Um, but one of the issues with that, which Campbell didn't do, is Campbell and people, when looking for earlier root myths, always assumed, of course, that it went black nothingness, creator, God, universe, people. And that apparently was not the earliest order that we reckoned creation went in. So it took a lot of counterintuitive thinking. I think now to talk about what the hero's journey is. So the hero's journey presumes these stages of a story, and these will sound familiar to you. The ordinary world, and if you have a poster with these are labeled differently, they're sometimes called differently. The hero starts out in his or her village. There's a call to adventure that can be when Luke finds his niece or his niece, not his niece and nephew, his uncle and aunt murdered. It can be when Neo first realizes there's something to the tattoo that he's been called. Initially, they're reluctant to go, but then they realize they have to. They meet the mentor. They cross the threshold. They leave the familiar world behind, get various allies, find changes, approach the inmost cave. It's some kind of preparation for a certain ordeal. This can be using the Force, learning to use the Force, getting the magic sword, uncovering the secret. Then they seize it. The road back, they journey home or to a new home. Luke Skywalker regains the family of Leia and Han Solo and Chewbacca that he lost. Resurrection, where the test of the hero is transformed and purified, and a return with the elixir. They can have this benefit of others. The evil is vanquished, so the water flows again, or whatever. And if you recognize these in stories, part of the issue is, and there's this famous circular representation of these, and sometimes it's called the return with the medallion, the return with the knowledge. So if you've seen an alternate representation of the hero's journey, you have, and sometimes it's fewer stages, they merge things together. But that's basically it. That's what his theory of what the hero's journey was. And what happens is it's taught in creative writing classes, and people love it. Star Wars was written intentionally with the hero's journey, right? A lot of writers are taught to write to it, and they are also taught. They're taught not that this is just a way of thinking. They're given a story, and they're saying, break it down, take this story, and find the pieces to put into the puzzle slot that is one of the 8 or 16, however the breakdown is, of the hero's journey. Here's the thing. The hero's journey is just a character, right? And a character arc is the transformation or inner journey or outer journey of the character through his stories. It can include overcoming internal struggles, achieving or failing. The hero's journey is just one kind of character arc, characterized by an internal change that mirrors the external adventure. This is different than a story arc, which can be where the story is more focused on a group of people or how an event affects various people. If you're guessing there's no hard and fast line between a story arc or a character arc, you're absolutely correct. But this is the thing. If you tell a writing student, if you want a grade, you will successfully find a way to cut up this story and fit it into any character arc I give you or any story arc that I give they will find a way to do it. And so if any of these examples I give of alternate story arcs or things that aren't really the hero's journey, you could find a way to make them the hero's journey, but you could also, the other examples I give, you could find a way to make anything. So this is all just an opinion, but I'd like you to consider it in aggregate. So to be really honest, the one kind of question I'm not going to entertain is this classic example of the hero's journey. Isn't there a way to make it not the hero's journey? Yes, of course there is. These are all just things that I and various other literary critics have said, but the point is it's not that universal. But the reason it seems so universal is that one, people write intentionally to it because they're taught that's what you have to do. And we'll see if you're a commercial writer, there's some good reason for doing that. But also they're taught to fit into it. So other popular character arcs, just to close out story arcs, which I was supposed to have a note on. Story arcs might be how an object or event affects various people, or a story of a world over time. And then you have ensemble arcs where it's more about the relationship of a team. There might be some hero's journey stories in the MCU, but the overall story told with thread is more an ensemble arc. And actually, we'll get to one in a minute. It's not very much. So there's a flat arc. the character does not change internally, but impacts the world around them. The best example of this is Indiana Jones, who's often taught because George Lucas and Steven Spielberg often wrote so much to the hero's journey, um, to the degree that they did. It's often assumed that Indiana Jones is, but Indiana Jones remains utterly inert. I haven't seen the most recent movie and don't intend to. I'm not saying it's bad, I just I haven't seen it. But the older films, there's even one of the films, a young woman whom he had relations with, sexual intercourse with, when she was technically a minor. Well, not technically a minor, when she was a minor, just says, "Do you want to talk about it?" He says, "No." Indiana Jones, barring the most recent movie with the time travel stuff that I haven't seen, does not change as he goes through his thing. So that's a flat arc. A corruption arc is somebody that descends into darkness, The Godfather. Less clearly, more back and forth, Walter White in Breaking Bad. The inverse journey. And the inverse journey is not like a chronological reversal, but like Tony Stark arc through the MCU is kind of a reversed hero's journey because he's choosing, he wants to change and change the world around him. And that's the only reason he goes on the journey. So the cart and the horse are reversed. Now, some people have pointed out if you view Tony's ultimate achieved goal, finally knowing peace by snapping the gauntlet and dying, you can kind of make it a more classic hero's journey. But he's an example of someone where it's funny because he says with the time travel thing in there, you didn't pull you didn't pull Ant-Man through time, you pulled time through Ant-Man. So Tony doesn't go on the hero's journey and transform because of it, because Tony wants to transform himself and the world around it. The journey comes to him. So it's almost a complete inversion of the journey. And the field hero arc, where they fail but do things in examples. So Llewellyn Davis, Anthony Mullins talks about, or Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull. If you cite the original call to action as so while the hero's journey is a powerful framework, it's not universally suited to all stories. And it also, there's a problem with its emphasis specifically on internal transformation. And it can focus too much on one person. And that can lead to what we have going on now with main character syndrome, where people are presuming themselves to be the main characters in other people's internal stories. You see them proudly posting about their main character energy. In my day job, I sometimes do project management. When I would say, if you bring your main character energy to a project that my team and I are working on, you're going to meet my narrator vibe. So that it also forces the idea of one person being too important. And for instance, I would say, I will go out a limb. I have made a choice between Trump and Harris. Neither one of them is great in my mind. One is slightly corrupt. The other is 10 times more corrupt. But the fact that there's so much cult of personality around either of them is, I think, an extent of this one person representing a change too much. Or blaming individual people too much for, say, the conflict between Hamas and the Netanyahu government, something like that. That being blamed not on full like cultural differences and complex social systems, but down to 2 or 3 men on each side. So it does have that effect. I think we covered a lot of this. Although Campbell was an atheist, there's themes of sacrifice, redemption, and resurrection feature heavily in it. And if you get into the idea of dying gods and things like that, those changed before Christianity had to figure out a way to make Jesus still work, even though he'd been crucified. So that's present in there. And so it's a very narrow Western-centric view, and even then, a view more primarily of Anglo-Saxon culture. It excludes Romance cultures. It excludes certain aspects of even the Greek and Roman heritage. It certainly includes Chinese, and cherry-picked versions of like Native American and indigenous stories. I think we covered everything else that's on this slide: selective interpretation, and then also a lot of reinforcement of traditional roles. It is very patriarchal. There's no way around it. There is a heroine's journey that we'll get into in a little minute, but as we see, that doesn't necessarily really solve the problem. But it's definitely centered on men and young men too. And also, usually the hero's journey protagonist will be a professional guy working in an office or a mechanic. He's usually not going to be something special, although he can be. He can be an astronaut or something like that. But most is what you'd call a John Every. Um, and you can say that that makes the character relatable, but then you run into the problem of the default human, who is always the gender, race, occupation, landowning status, not too rich, not too poor, orientation of whatever the norm of the culture is considered. And so if you are part of that norm, you don't notice when a character is that. That's just a basic character to you. But you maybe feel overly pushed to notice if they're not that. So the hero's journey includes that default human, whatever that is. And the default human, by the way, is particularly bad in another area of research, which is biomedicine, where until recently, healthy 30-year-old, generally white and occasionally black men were used to test medicines, or college students who were available as resource populations for various medications were used. And then it was just presumed it worked for everyone else of every age, every gender, every nutrition level, regardless of other health applications. So the default human is problematic. Other arcs, we talked about this, you can hammer any kind of arc in. Story arc, as we mentioned, is how events and actions unfold over time. In a mystery, the arc of the story involves the stages of the mystery. That's a really good example. I should have thought of that earlier. Character arcs we've talked about. Theme arcs evolve where a theme of an event or is seen affecting different characters. This is particularly good with an ensemble cast. Relationship arcs, I don't think require an explanation. And these arcs can intersect. And again, you could make a good argument and a compelling argument to fit any story into any type of arc. But if you just tell people that they all fit into one arc, they will find a way to do it. And if you tell them you must write to this, they will. So beyond all the representation problems, the hero's journey is a predictable formula that it can restrict creative potential. And since it emphasizes internal transformation, it will not fit all stories, sometimes with really genuine external conflicts or systemic issues, limiting its effectiveness for certain stories. It can also downplay complex external forces and downplay the role of culture. The hero's journey tends to portray the world as fundamentally good, marred by an external evil that the hero has to overcome. And this can be inadequate for the world where society itself is intrinsically or corrupt. Sometimes there's a workaround that say society is not real, it's the matrix, and the real world is the honest, struggle freedom fighters outside. Although if you actually get into the tie-in media for the matrix, even that world is not really good. But so it's not good if we're dealing with things like post-capitalism, like things like Snowpiercer and Parasite that deal a lot with post-capitalism. You can't really deal with that with a single hero's triumph. The problem of hierarchical structures. The Handmaid's Tale is essentially a critique of hierarchical structure. And again, Hero's Journey won't work for that. The dangers of populist democracy. V for Vendetta is a good one of that. That starts out as it's a critique of populism disguised as a celebration of populism. A lot of people that still wear the Guy Fawkes mask with pride don't kind of get that. I mean, you can process however you want, but the hero's journey doesn't necessarily fit very well there. And marginalization, things like stories like The Hate You Give and Moonlight that are basically about even people who normally don't like stories about systemic oppression really seem to resonate with those. Hero's journey doesn't fit very well with those. Anthony Mullins, who has some great videos on this, brings up the show Promising Young Woman. And in it, the character Cassie, played by Carey Mulligan, starts out, basically she will go out to bars and pretend to be intoxicated and find men who may be sexual predators and stop them in their tracks. She's basically kind of a vigilante. I mean, that's too strong of a word. The story evolves, and it's about somebody who's really taking on like rape culture and things like that. There is an episode where she says, maybe I should give this up at some point, right? She contemplates going on the hero's journey, going on an internal change, saying maybe life isn't all about this. I should find love and find a family. But then she couldn't do the things she does. Ironically, really similar to actually a recent storytelling where Batman considered marrying Catwoman, and she realized if you're happy, you won't be able to be Batman. Batman contemplates going on the hero's journey. Batman never completes his internal change. So ironically, Batman, who's considered by most people a privileged white um, superhero, but is also neurodivergent, traumatized, and an atheist, by the way, so is very much in three ways not belonging to privileged cultures, has a lot with Cassie. But Cassie cannot engage on the hero's journey and engage in the heroic acts that she does. Another problem is it's really popularized the magical deuteragonist. And this is a character that exists only to serve as a source of wisdom or supernatural help for the hero. And they often also embody very simplistic morality. I follow the rules. I don't question the rules. I'm good and I follow them. Which emphasizes that good people follow rules and follow laws, whether those laws are helpful or harmful or not, rather than making their own decisions about complex moral situations. Only highfalutin people that think they have a right to decide right and wrong themselves, which is wrong, do that. Good people follow the rules. And just like you saw, there is the magical Negro, which is like John Coffey in The Green Mile or Bagger Vance. That's just been parodied in the American Society of Magical Negroes who exist only to help the white protagonist. The wise old mentor, like Gandalf, older people are not Dumbledore. They exist mainly to help the younger person along. The sage from nature, who's often a woman, women, or indigenous people are closer to Earth, nature, have a certain wisdom. They can't be the hero. They can help with that. And one we don't talk about, which is the magical country person, who's usually white, often Southern, and often poor, like Forrest Gump. And they're portrayed as just simply knowing right from wrong and not really existing for their own means. It's just like the wise country person. But it's the wise, simple country folk is just as insidious as the magical Negro. Deuteroagonists in general are bad. Because remember, you, and everyone watching this, we're the deuteroagonist in everybody else's story. And I would invite you, when somebody really needs it, be the best deuteroagonist you can. You don't have to be the protagonist at every given moment. Try being part of the ensemble cast. And these characters are fine, but we over rely on them. And in any given culture, it's not just race; it's class too, right? They emphasize simplicity, and also we're supposed to really admire the fact that they are rule followers, not necessarily goodness or virtue followers or ethics followers, but rule followers. They're obedient. So that's the other side that's not talked about. Some subversions of this are Shuri, specifically in Black Panther 1 and in Endgame, with the little sister, but in fact, she's more of a rationalist and an empiricist than T'Challa is. Yes, she goes on a very classic hero's journey in her own movie later. But early on, Furiosa in Mad Max, because it's interesting, because the focus actually shifts protagonists, arguably, at one point to her. And Llewellyn Davis in Llewellyn Davis is like a failed hero. He undertakes the journey, but he overcomes it, subverting the traditional faces of that. Some other subversions of that, contemporary storytelling, not so much about representation, though some of these are good representation, can be Miles Morales into the Spider-Verse. Miles, yes, he is a representation of a group that wasn't Spider-Man before, but one of the most important things about him is that almost in every portrayals of Miles is always has a shared collaborative thing with his friends and his family around him, even the other Spider-Men and Into the Spider-Verse. I think that's Miles in there. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But he's very much not a singular character, and his supporting characters are ensembles, right? So that's actually, I think, Miles's biggest departure from the classic hero's journey. That the focus is not just on him; it's all about a lot of shared success. Nina in the Nightingale is a complex hero that emphasizes, the futility of revenge and trauma. The narrative doesn't provide catharsis, and the harsh realities of violence, subverting the hero's journey. And there's no promise of restoration and growth or a triumphant return. And it questions the very notion of victory at all. Jules in Euphoria is a subversion. Jules starts out a lot like the wise old mentor, but then the story decentralizes away, becomes more ensemble. And I mean, that happens in a lot of shows with the wise old mentor where they're around long enough, they have to be fleshed out. But Jules is, I think, a really good example of that. And you can say that Ruth in The Farewell is an example of like an anti-hero's journey, where internal conflict arises from cultural dissonance and various family dynamics. And rather than a real clear transformational moment, the story is defined very much by the tension, and it's very nuanced and kind of gritty. So these are just examples of modern eras that challenge not just in representation, but the linearity or the structure. Some of them, as you can see, are very famous superhero ones. Others are probably a little more deep digging. And also a rejection of traditional narrative authority can be this, but this is just like contemporary stories. A lot of times with experimental literature have to go outside. Experimental filmmaking, new modes of storytelling. If you just use broken up chronology, but have all the pieces of the hero's journey, that can still be the hero's journey, but bypassing that. The one example that sounds silly is BoJack Horseman, right? In that it parodies that BoJack wants that whole show to be about him. He wants to be on the hero's journey, but his ensemble supporting cast, all his magical deuteragonists, refuse to be deuteragonists. Right? They all demand to be fleshed out, and he engages so much with his internal world and makes himself so much the main character that he fails to engage into the internal world and can't change the external world. You can argue that he does in the last episode. I would argue he does, but that's fine. But I'm talking about most of the seasons up until the sort of the end of the show. And then like Sense8 or even The Witcher, right? Even The Witcher books, even though Geralt is the protagonist, Geralt always has a kind of like so Sense8 and I think The Witcher in any of its forms, maybe the TV show least of all, but even there, as you get into the later seasons, The Witcher has always been an ensemble. It's not one man. It's not just about Geralt. It's about various people that he interacts with who come in and out of his life. So why do some people defend the hero's journey when it's criticized at all? And I'm not here to say never do the hero's journey, but why do some people, even when you have a little bit of criticism toward it, react so badly? Well, there's a familiarity with it, an appeal, and a comfort to it, and there's a hyper awareness of it. Even if you weren't aware of this, I'm willing to bet that 50% of the people watching this lecture knew it. And it's not a far jump from something like Star Wars that is intentionally written to the hero's journey and fond childhood memories of it. She's saying, well, if you're saying the hero's journey is just from Campbell and he had some errors doing it, it can be quick dominoes to saying you're taking a dump on my memories of being with mom and dad and my brother and sister watching Star Wars. It can feel hurtful to people. That's not really the intention. These familiar structures can become stale and they limit creativity, and we still teach people they have to write to this structure. The other one I'll tell you is you don't have to kill your darlings, but that's another lecture. You don't have to always kill your darlings. There's absolutely nothing you have to always do in writing. The minute you think there's a have to do, but do the one thing you think you can't do or you're forbidden from doing. Although don't take that too far. Perceived criticism, it can be perceived as deconstructionism. I myself hate just deconstructionism, where you're just taking methodology apart, deconstructing the building up of something systemic, and then not really doing anything with it. But I've suggested how it can be used for more creative storytelling and given some examples. But it can just be perceived as, if you're not familiar with the criticism of hyper deconstructionism, it's just kind of eggheads talking about criticizing and taking things apart for the sake of taking them apart. It can feel like that to people. And for some people, let's move forward a little bit. There are art adaptations to an Afrocentric hero's journey. and a heroine's journey, focused on a woman, for example, or anything like that, that can feel like forced diversity to people because even again there's not a lot of say atheist or like Asian American hero's journey models. So only certain diversity is usually let in, and it can feel like forced diversity to people. But these are great. These were great progress. But even if you do that, you now have a model that's not universal because a heroine's journey isn't necessarily going to help people who are people of color. Um, and an Afrocentric version is not going to help people who are necessarily working class. It might. And it also doesn't solve any of the creative stifling problems because it's just the hero's journey with a paint job. So, but it can feel like a lot of times the quick answer to the hero's journey, because people secretly love it, is just to make it about women instead of men, to make it about an LGBTQIA version, to make it a Russian version, French version, but not really change anything else, just change the outer paint. And then none of the other problems are solved by that. We talked about the default human specific cultural lenses. Now, what I will say is if you are a commercial writer, you definitely need to know how to write to it. Because this story is familiar, and sometimes even to people picking out stages of what they view as the monomyth in a story feels good. So know how to write a good hero's journey story if primarily what you want to be as a commercial writer. And I'm not saying you have to write every story to the hero's journey if you want to be commercially successful, but know how to do it. And definitely if you're writing something that's basically mostly for a paycheck. And that's not a criticism. That might be how you feed your family. So commercial writers kind of need to adhere to it for now. But if we get people comfortable with enough non-hero's journey storytelling, they won't have to. But so don't beat up commercial writers too much because that's how they're putting food on the table. And I think we largely talked about this. So this is just a fun tongue-in-cheek thing. Don't take this too seriously. So how do you hero's journey proof your story? Avoid the reluctant hero who says no at first, but always says yes in the end. Not every character needs to be persuaded to go on a quest. Consider letting your protagonist actively choose from day one to engage in a heroic role supporting completely conscious agency. Kill the mentor before they can impart knowledge, or let them survive and take over. Kill off the young hero. Have the mentor take over. You're absolutely cracked the hero's journey with that. Have the young heroes die and have Obi-Wan and Dumbledore be the one to continue. Give the villain depth. Now this is tricky because Anakin Skywalker can be viewed as having depth, and you could say he's therefore there's a Holmes and Moriarty thing with him and Yoda or him and Obi-Wan if you want. But there are some things there clearly there's not also an evil empire or an evil force corrupting the otherwise perfect world. Say Holmes and Moriarty or Batman and Joker's rivalry. Magneto is a great example. Complex villain, anti-hero, or straight up hero in some versions. And the villain has a real motivation other than right? That'll pretty much do it. Subvert the heroes to the elixir. There's nothing to bring back to save the world. There's no phlebotinum or plot device, or have the hero return with nothing. And that could, challenge notions of what victory is. Chosen one prophecy is not going to usually help you unless you're doing parody. Chosen one prophecy instead focus on someone who's surprisingly ordinary and remains ordinary. They don't become great or discover their greatness within, or their ordinariness is what's great. Let the hero fail. We've talked about that. Requiem for a Dream or Children of Men can be examples of that. Write a story where the world itself is flawed. And I think the hero's journey is a little bit responsible for something I'm going to soapbox a little bit here, in that religion and spirituality often push the idea that the universe is flawless. And I think there's a way of viewing that the universe is neither flawed or that's not flawed or flawless. It shouldn't be measured in those scales. But that whatever you is doing are wrong, and you're just unaligned with the universe. But that's not a far step from saying that society is correct. And I think while there is a mental health crisis in this country, for sure, and there are people that need therapy and even need medication. I myself am in therapy. I think there is also a crisis of us telling people the problem is not the world, your economic situation, the abusive situation you're in, the political climate in your country, the situation of your job, your health issue. That's all okay. You should really be okay with that. And if you're not, you need therapy. So I think it's led to some collective gaslighting. Sometimes the flaw is out there. So have stories where sometimes the flaw is out there. Um, you don't always have to have a moral resolution, right? Or you can have the characters decide what the moral resolution is and be clear it's not the only one that there could have been. Um, very highly collaborative stories across cultures, a collaborative group, a shared group over time. One, they have them, if you, even if you break the hero's journey stages up, you'll subvert it, but often you can avoid it. And then just celebrate wickedness, the Wolf of Wall Street, Psycho, Joker, the first Joker, not Joker Folie à Deux, which watched half of it, and like the fact that I couldn't even, it's like they didn't even try. Like the fact that I wasn't even appalled at how bad it was just simply bad. Um, yeah, and the one thing that actually I was thought wouldn't be good was Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn. She's probably the best thing in that as Lee Quinn, and she's hardly in it. So anyway, and it also undoes the first movie, and you can no longer decide if it was in his head or not. It definitely happened. So I meant all right, but a celebration of wickedness or the reverse Joker or the Joker and all that stuff. And there's my reasonable number of sources. Remember, my last lecture was like 20 pages, but those are just the sources. And also, just to go back quickly, if you feel like staying on YouTube, if you Google that, this is a link. Maybe I could put the link in the chat, or we'll put the link in the out there. But that Earth Driver thing, John Wade's lecture, if you Google this thing across the screen, the oldest all capitals creation myth in the world and its origins, you will come up to a full blown lecture of the Earth Driver myth, where he'll also get right what I got wrong. Can I stop screen sharing without stopping recording? No, apparently I can't. Okay, so we will just give me a second. I'm having some problems. We'll just go back to the title page and doop doop doop, and back to the AI generated lady in medieval underwear who popped out as one of my options, and I said that will make people watch the trailer. They did. So questions. See if anyone is also texting questions. Oh, Ashley, I'll let you go first, but let me see. There might actually be.
All right. Yeah, hello. Switch the screens over so I can see our beautiful faces. Um, there was one question from YouTube. Are there any examples of stories that go against or deconstruct the hero's journey?
You mean like so? I mean, we gave a lot, so unfortunately, I'm gonna have to kind of. Can the asker clarify? Do they mean that they like directly that is what the story is about, almost in a meta way? I'm asking because there's a lot of stories that deconstruct the hero's journey, but in a very like direct way.
I think it's like if they wanted to read something, like if they wanted to pull something up off Netflix.
I mean, any of the examples that we gave of in here, I mean, I'm trying to think of something that um, specifically specifically like sets out to kind of it's a metaphoric challenge to the hero's journey. Promising Young Woman, Mullins gives an example, is a great is an absolutely great example of that. I'm trying to think of some superhero stuff that does that. I would say, I mean, Doom Patrol.
Okay.
Doom Patrol definitely directly challenges not only superhero motifs, but like there are episodes of Doom Patrol that directly absolutely challenge that, right? Let me look in my own chat. Okay. I have my own chat up. If anybody chats in the Zoom chat, I'll see the questions too on there. Doom Patrol, I think, would be a direct thing where they actually talk about the stages of the hero's journey. There's never like they don't say Joseph Campbell instead of the hero's journey, but probably the most conscious thing I can think of. Um, I mean, in a lot of Marvel and DC writing, some of the better has been a direct challenge to the hero's journey. I'm trying to think of a movie that, not just that it doesn't follow the hero's journey, but that's kind of the bread and butter of what it does.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would say Doom Patrol is a good example of that. Promising Young Woman, like if you want to go on Netflix. Um, BoJack, I'm trying to think of a film so you don't have to invest in a series. I'm thinking of a lot of literature that's very meta, like a lot of self-aware literature that where storytelling itself, where the story is aware it's a story. That's almost
Hmm.
break the hero's journey. But we can put some things up in the chat later. I can't think of a film you could do in one washing. I know there are, but thinking of books and series mostly. But there are. Well, there's two of them. Anyway, on my screen. Um, other questions?
Adam, do you have any questions?
I don't. I had some follow up on some of the things you'd said earlier, but
Oh, what are your
not really relevant. I don't think too much.
okay.
Yeah, so that was it. And the next lecture will be on J.R.R. Tolkien, uh,
Okay.
about how reasonable person can call him a great writer, mediocre writer, or hack. Same thing about world building, but I'm going to challenge the notion that there's even if you don't particularly like him, he undebatably was one of the best early IP and media property brand managers. He set out to be, he didn't hide it, and he completely succeeded in that to this day. And because even with the Rings of Power, the entity that he started and his grandson are very much involved in the Rings of Power. And while he may not have liked the storytelling, or maybe he would have, he probably wouldn't have, even though I like the Rings of Power, but he probably would like the success, including the financial aspect of it. So it's going to be about Tolkien as a brand manager,
Interesting.
and also allowing space to not like it. It's okay to not like it. Right? I'll get another one. It's okay to not like Shakespeare. As a Callum Kerr talked about that in our thing with him before. It's okay to not like anything.
Hmm.
Um, all right, and I think that's it. And
Do you have a time for the next lecture series?
oh, the date hasn't been put out yet.
Okay, okay. Where can people find you, Chris? Owain, CL.
Um, you can my YouTube channel is dash HUH. I don't have a Facebook account, all one word on Instagram. You can also Google and Heduana model, E I should remember this. Enhedun. And well, okay. Google search how to spell Enheduanna, the first known author, and then search Co Ebert Ebert, like my name on the screen, and you can get copies of my model and my page from the university. Or you can Google the Ophelia Mythos books. See that. Also on my YouTube channel are varying degrees of qualities of audiobooks that I have done over the years, from ones I'm really proud of to things that I've left up, despite the fact that they are embarrassing. But if you want free audiobook entertainment that may or may not be good, you can also find it.
All right. So, do we have any other parting thoughts for the lovely people tonight?
No, I will just let you do the outro and then I'll kill the Zoom because just want to make sure one more time. There were some people in the was there anybody? Let me just see if anybody. I just want to make sure that one of these is not a got it. Okay, not a question. All right. Also, that's not a question. And one more chance. Any questions by Zoom? Going once, going twice. Okay.
And if you have any questions after the fact, like you're watching this in the future, leave a comment. We'll be checking those out and we can possibly answer them during the next question and answer a
Great.
lecture series, right?
We'll actually say leave the questions if you can on. We'll put up the link on my YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
not on the if it's okay, not on the Geeked Out one.
I could forward them to you if they end up coming to me anyway.
We
Does
can
that work?
we can spell that out later, but
Yeah.
for now, let's leave people without instruction. You can leave it on my YouTube.
Okay.
And you want to do the outro, and I'll wait to
Yeah,
kill.
sure. So that's been us. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Owain Drag for having another lovely lecture for us. We can feel that we're all are mentally charged for the day. We've had our learning that we had to do for the day to learn one thing. So we can go out and now relax the rest of our day. Um, we'll be coming back here 6 p.m. Eastern for Pal World. So be sure to come back and check us out for that. And tomorrow is going to be our very spooky tabletop game with Tony
Looking forward to
King.
that.
It's very Halloween-tacular using the Kids on Bikes system, which is kind of like Stranger Things, but tabletop role-playing game. It's I don't know how terrifying it's going to be. I'm not sure if we're going to need content warnings. I guess we'll approach that before the show starts the day of. So stay locked in for that. Thank you for everything. And this is us saying goodbye, and we'll see you next time. And see you later.
All right. Are we off? Do you need me to wait to kill the Zoom? Okay. So I'm actually going to end the Zoom then because, okay, thank you to everybody that watched asynchronously. And thank you everyone who came live. And again, feel free to stick comments in there. I'm not going to tell you to like and subscribe because it doesn't matter because I have so few followers and never will. The algorithm is never going to love me. So just leave your comments and questions. Like and subscribe if you wish, but I refuse to drink the Kool-Aid of like and subscribe. All right. Thank you. And I will stop the share and I will end the meeting. Thank you, everybody.